The birth of Israel. Every great story has a point of origin, and in the history of Israel, that origin is like an ancient mist that blends myth, archaeology, and collective memory. There is no single foundational moment, no clear birth certificate, but rather a long, complex, and deeply human process. Everything begins more than 3,000 years ago in a region known as Canaan, a territory located between the desert and the sea, between great empires that came and went like gigantic hourglasses marking the life and death of peoples. The first Hebrews who walked these lands did not arrive as a conquering army or a homogeneous mass. They were semi-nomadic clans, families who lived from agriculture and herding, seeking refuge in the hills to escape the control of the great powers that ruled the fertile plains. The Bible, a historical and religious source in equal parts, speaks of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the patriarchs of this people. But archaeology offers us a more scattered, more chaotic, and much more real panorama. These first Israelites were nothing more than one of many tribes struggling to survive in a scarce and violent land. In those early stages, the religion they practiced was a mosaic of beliefs. The God Yahweh was beginning to consolidate as a central figure, but monotheism was not yet absolute. There were cults to local deities, practices that today would be considered foreign to Judaism, and fertility rituals that spoke of a society in transformation. The Hebrew identity was being built as these groups developed a common consciousness, marked by language, oral tradition, and resistance against those who sought to dominate them. The first major political structure that attempted to unite these scattered tribes was the kingdom of Saul. The Philistine threat to the west, with its well-armed armies and superior military technology, was the catalyst that pushed the Hebrews to organize themselves. Saul was anointed as king by the prophet Samuel, but his reign was plagued by internal conflicts and erratic decisions that eventually undermined his leadership. Upon his death, a young shepherd, musician, and warrior named David emerged as the figure destined to change everything. David was not simply a military leader. He was the architect of a new vision of unity. He conquered Jerusalem, a city of strategic importance, but which until then did not belong to any of the Hebrew tribes. By turning it into the political and spiritual capital, David made a decisive move that transformed the perception of Israel from a simple tribal confederation into a kingdom in the process of consolidation. The choice of Jerusalem was not accidental. It was located in a neutral zone, at the border between the northern and southern tribes, which prevented any single tribe from having absolute dominance over the others. Furthermore, its symbolic value began to grow thanks to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred object that represented the presence of Yahweh among his people. David was much more than a conqueror. He was a political strategist, a skilled negotiator, and a charismatic leader who knew how to connect with the emotions of his people. After the death of David, his son Solomon inherited a kingdom that still needed consolidation. Solomon is remembered for his wisdom, but also for his constructive ambition. During his reign, the kingdom of Israel reached an unprecedented level of stability and prosperity. It was under his rule that the first temple of Jerusalem was built, a building that functioned not only as a religious center, but also as the ultimate symbol of national unity. The temple represented the institutionalization of the faith in Yahweh, a place where the people could feel directly connected to their God, in the very heart of their land. The construction of the temple was also a declaration of power to the neighboring kingdoms. Its building required enormous economic and human resources, including alliances with other peoples, such as the Phoenicians of Tyre, who supplied materials and architectural knowledge. Jerusalem was transformed into a center of commerce, culture, and spirituality. Solomon, with his famous network of political treaties and diplomatic marriages, ensured that Israel was respected and in some cases feared by the surrounding empires. However, not everything was harmony and prosperity. The accumulation of wealth, the increase in taxes, and the forced labor required to carry out the grand public works began to generate discontent among the population. The splendor of the kingdom concealed internal tensions that, upon the death of Solomon, would erupt with force. The end of the United Period was abrupt. The division between the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south marked the beginning of a long era of conflicts, invasions, and political changes that would accompany the people of Israel for centuries. The territorial fragmentation was merely the reflection of cultural, economic, and religious differences that had already been forming for some time. And thus, in just a few decades, Israel went from being a collection of pastoral tribes to becoming a centralized kingdom, with a fortified capital and a monumental temple. This was the birth of Israel, not as a single, sudden act, but as the result of a process full of struggles, difficult decisions, and key moments that gradually shaped a collective identity. The Golden Age of Israel. The moment had arrived when Israel seemed to have achieved what so many generations had long fought for: stability, recognition, and a prosperity that was reflected in every corner of Jerusalem. The vision of unity that David had initiated took on an almost perfect form under the reign of his son Solomon. It was a period that, centuries later, tradition and collective memory would recall as the highest point in Israel's ancient history. An age where politics, religion, and the economy intertwined to create the illusion of permanence, as if that glory would last forever. At the heart of this splendor was, without a doubt, Jerusalem. The city became not only the administrative and military center, but also a spiritual reference that began to be mentioned beyond its borders. The recently completed temple was not just a building. It was the visible symbol of the covenant between Yahweh and his people. Its limestone walls, carved columns, and the gold adorning the most holy place were testimony to the wealth the kingdom had accumulated in just a few years. Solomon was a ruler with an uncommon political skill. He understood that military strength alone was not enough to maintain the cohesion of a diverse kingdom. For this reason, he sought alliances, signed treaties, and promoted trade agreements with neighboring powers. The exchange of goods with Egypt, Tyre, and other city-states in the region brought Israel precious metals, exotic woods, luxury fabrics, and new artisanal techniques. Cultural influence also flowed in both directions. The caravans entering and leaving Jerusalem carried not only merchandise, but also ideas, customs, and architectural styles that transformed the urban landscape and everyday habits. The administration of the kingdom was more organized than ever before. Solomon divided the territory into tax districts to optimize the collection of tributes. This measure made it possible to fund the major public works that characterized his reign. In addition to the temple, palaces, fortifications, and water supply systems were built, improving life in the city and its surroundings. The kingdom was under constant construction, generating employment, economic movement, and a sense of unstoppable progress. But it was not all stone, wood, and gold. Solomon's wisdom became a personal hallmark. The audiences in his court were known for the way he resolved complex disputes, applying judgment that, on more than one occasion, surprised those present with its ingenuity and sense of justice. The story of the two women who claimed to be the mother of the same child is just one of many tales that tradition has preserved to illustrate this aspect of his reign. The image of the just and wise king crossed borders, attracting the attention of foreign monarchs, such as the legendary Queen of Sheba, who traveled to Jerusalem to test his fame. The economy experienced notable growth thanks to international trade. Israel became a commercial bridge between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The port of Ezion-Geber, at the northern end of the Red Sea, served as a gateway for products arriving from Arabia and beyond. The trade of spices, metals, and precious stones enriched the royal treasury, but also encouraged the development of a local merchant class that began to gain power and influence. Architecture was another visible sign of this golden age. Solomon's palaces were described by later chroniclers as true marvels of engineering. Great halls with carved columns, inner courtyards with gardens, and thrones covered in ivory formed an environment that commanded respect and admiration from any foreign visitor. Everything was designed to project an image of lasting power and absolute control over the kingdom's destiny. Religion, for its part, experienced a process of centralization without precedent. The worship of Yahweh came to be regulated from Jerusalem, and the temple functioned as the only official sanctuary. This was a decisive step in strengthening religious unity, although at the same time, it began to generate tensions among those more traditional sectors who remained attached to ancient local altars. The gradual elimination of other centers of worship was not an easy task, but it was seen as necessary to consolidate a homogeneous spiritual identity. However, beneath that surface of wealth and prestige, cracks were beginning to emerge. The fiscal administration, although efficient in terms of collection, was harsh on the poorer classes. The tax burden grew steadily, and the labor demands for the kingdom's projects only increased the popular discontent. The luxurious life at court contrasted with the reality of the peasants, who were beginning to feel marginalized by a system that favored urban and commercial elites. Solomon's reign lasted 40 years, and by the end of his life, the stability that had been so difficult to build began to waver. The marriage alliances, which had initially been diplomatic tools, brought with them the influence of foreign cults within the borders of Israel. Altars dedicated to gods from distant lands began to rise, and with them, the religious purity that had been so hard to establish began to erode. The aristocracy was increasingly divided between those who wanted to preserve tradition and those who were open to new external influences. When Solomon died, he left his son Rehoboam a kingdom that appeared solid, but was internally fractured. The tensions that had been contained for years exploded violently as soon as the new king took the throne. The northern tribes, tired of taxes and labor burdens, rebelled and declared their own kingdom. What had been a golden age suddenly became the prologue to a deep political crisis. The image left by this period was one of a splendor that seemed eternal, but like everything in human history, had an expiration date. What had begun as the time of greatest glory in the history of Israel would soon be remembered with nostalgia, as future generations faced an increasingly hostile and divided world. And while crowns wore down and borders began to blur, on the horizon loomed a threat that would forever change the kingdom's destiny. The gaze of greater, more powerful empires, with ambitions that no king of Israel could ignore for long. Cyrus the Great and the return from exile. The stones of Jerusalem, those that once held up the splendor of Solomon's temple, had been left in ruins. What the people of Israel had built over centuries was destroyed in a matter of months by the Babylonian army. It was the year 586 before the Common Era, when King Nebuchadnezzar II ordered the total destruction of the city and the exile of thousands of Jews. For many, that moment marked the end of an era, the abrupt closure of an identity that seemed impossible to sustain far from their land. The experience of exile in Babylon was a deep wound, both physical and spiritual. The religious elite, the artisans, the merchants, all were torn from their homes and taken hundreds of kilometers away to a completely different environment. There, in the midst of a foreign land, without a temple and without a political structure of their own, the Jewish people faced one of the greatest challenges in their history: preserving their identity. For decades, those exiles had to adapt to new customs, a different language, and a belief system that had nothing to do with Yahweh. However, something extraordinary happened in that time of uprooting. Instead of fading, their faith grew stronger. It was during that period that many of the texts that now form the foundation of the Tanakh began to be compiled and written. Prayer, oral tradition, and the memory of Jerusalem became the emotional refuge of a people determined not to disappear. Meanwhile, on the broader stage of geopolitics, a new power began to emerge from the east. Persia, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, began a military expansion that would forever change the map of the Near East. Cyrus was not just any king. He had a vision that went beyond mere territorial conquest. His policy toward conquered peoples was different from that of the Babylonians or the Assyrians. Where others imposed terror and destruction, Cyrus practiced diplomacy, religious respect, and integration. In the year 539 before the Common Era, Babylon fell. The city, once considered impregnable, opened its gates without major resistance. Cyrus was received as a liberator. Soon after, he issued a decree that would go down in history, the Edict of Cyrus. In it, he allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples and ways of life. For the Jews, it was news that seemed almost unreal. The return to Jerusalem was neither immediate nor massive. Not everyone wanted to go back. After nearly 50 years, many Jews had already settled in Babylon, built businesses, started families, and begun new lives. But a determined group, led by figures such as Zerubbabel and Joshua, undertook the long journey home, carrying the hope of rebuilding what was once their homeland. The landscape they encountered upon arrival was desolate. The walls were in ruins, the houses destroyed, and the temple reduced to a pile of charred rubble. Yet the will to rebuild was stronger than fear or exhaustion. The first thing they raised was a new altar. There, in that small space of stones piled up with effort, the restoration of religious life began. The reconstruction of the temple was a slow process, full of difficulties. The local population, which had occupied the city during the exile, did not always welcome the return of the former inhabitants. There were tensions, sabotage, and even external threats. The prophets of the time, such as Haggai and Zechariah, encouraged the people not to give up, to keep faith that the work had to be completed. In parallel, the figure of Ezra gained prominence. As a scribe and religious leader, Ezra brought with him a copy of the law, the set of precepts that would give coherence and structure to the newly re-established Jewish community. The public reading of the Torah, in the middle of the square, was an act that would mark a turning point in the collective consciousness of the people. It was much more than a religious ritual. It was the reaffirmation of an identity that had survived exile, destruction, and despair. The second wave of returnees, led by Nehemiah, focused on a task that, while less spiritual, was fundamental: rebuilding the city walls. Without proper defenses, Jerusalem would remain vulnerable. Under Nehemiah's direction, and in record time, the inhabitants managed to raise new fortifications. That achievement was not only architectural, it was psychological. It meant that Jerusalem was once again a living city, protected and ready to write a new chapter of its history. Cyrus the Great, from his capital in Persepolis, never set foot in Jerusalem. But his political decision was crucial for the rebirth of Jewish life in the city. The people of Israel never forgot that gesture. In fact, in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is referred to as the Anointed of the Lord, a surprising title considering he was not Jewish. Yet his figure was remembered as that of a divine instrument, someone chosen to help fulfill an ancient promise. The Persian era brought a profound change in how the Jews understood their own history. The experience of exile and return reinforced the notion of a chosen people, capable of withstanding the harshest trials. It also laid the foundation for many of the religious practices that would later be consolidated during the period of the Second Temple. From that moment on, Jerusalem ceased to be merely a physical place. It became a symbol, a spiritual goal that would always be present in the minds of the Jews, even in their darkest moments. The material reconstruction was important, but what was truly rebuilt in those years was an unbreakable conviction. The certainty that dispersion did not mean the end, but a new opportunity to begin again. And so, as the stones of the Second Temple were placed one by one, as the walls rose and the streets came back to life, a new stage began for the people of Israel. A stage that would soon be shaken by new winds of change coming from the other end of the known world. For history, in its relentless course, was already preparing the arrival of a conqueror whose ambition and charisma would transform the cultural and political map of the region in ways no one could have foreseen. Alexander the Great and the Hellenization. The calm brought by Persian rule, with its decrees of tolerance and relatively stable government structure, would not last forever. From the distant kingdom of Macedonia, north of Greece, a young king was preparing one of the most ambitious military campaigns the ancient world had ever seen. His name was Alexander, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, and possessor of a vision that surpassed any imaginable boundary for his time. When Alexander the Great began his march eastward, he did so with a small army in numbers, but vast in discipline and motivation. His declared goal was to overthrow the Persian Empire, but his ambition went much further. What began as a war of conquest transformed into a project of cultural integration that would affect every people he encountered along the way. Among them, the Jewish communities of Jerusalem and the many cities in the region. In the year 332 before the Common Era, Alexander arrived in the region of Judea. Legend, woven with threads of history and tradition, says that when the young conqueror approached Jerusalem, he was received by a delegation of priests led by the high priest, dressed in ceremonial robes. According to that same tradition, Alexander showed respect for the city and its temple, and allowed the Jews to continue their religious practices. The exact details of that encounter are difficult to verify, but what is undeniable is that Judea became part of his vast empire without a direct war. What began then was a process far slower and deeper than any military occupation: Hellenization. This term, seemingly technical, hides a cultural transformation that penetrated every aspect of life. The Greek language became the lingua franca of commerce and administration. Cities began to adopt the model of the Greek polis, with their agoras, theaters, and gymnasiums. Philosophy, art, and daily customs began to filter even into the most conservative communities. For the Jews, this new reality represented an existential dilemma. On one hand, access to Hellenistic culture offered undeniable advantages: commercial possibilities, political recognition, and access to new forms of knowledge. On the other hand, it posed a risk of assimilation and the possible loss of the identity they had fought so hard to preserve, especially after the traumatic exile in Babylon. The more open sectors within Jewish society saw Greek culture as an opportunity for progress. Hebrew names adapted to Greek appeared, sacred texts began to be translated, and many young people started attending gymnasiums, where physical and philosophical education formed a unified curriculum. The influence went beyond language or architecture. It penetrated the way of thinking, debating, and organizing local institutions. However, among the more traditional sectors, concern grew. Jewish law, with its rituals, dietary restrictions, and emphasis on separating the chosen people from other nations, became increasingly difficult to uphold in a context where the dominant culture promoted completely different values. Individualism, religious relativism, and the emphasis on physical perfection clashed with the ethical rigor and communal obligations that defined Judaism. After Alexander's sudden death in Babylon in the year 323 before the Common Era, his immense empire was divided among his generals, known as the Diadochi. The struggle for control over Judea began between two of those emerging powers, the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, established in Syria. For several decades, Judea became a point of dispute between these two royal houses, often caught in the crossfire of their interests. Under Ptolemaic rule, the Jews enjoyed a period of relative stability. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander, became an important cultural center where one of the most significant Jewish communities of the ancient world flourished. It was in this context that the translation of the Torah into Greek was born, known as the Septuagint. While it facilitated access to the scriptures for Jews who no longer spoke Hebrew, it also sparked internal debate about how appropriate it was to adapt the sacred word to a foreign language. But everything changed when the Seleucids took control of Judea. King Antiochus III was initially well received, but his successor, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, would take Hellenization to an extreme that provoked one of the greatest religious crises in Jewish history. During his reign, many traditional rituals were banned, practitioners of Mosaic law were persecuted, and, perhaps most shocking, the temple in Jerusalem was desecrated and converted into a space for the worship of Zeus. But before delving into the details of that period of persecution, it is important to understand that this entire conflict was the natural consequence of a process that had been unfolding for decades. Hellenization was not merely a policy imposed from outside. It was an internal tension, a conflict between generations, a struggle between modernity and tradition. The figure of Alexander the Great became a symbol of the seed that, once planted in Jewish soil, would grow in unexpected ways, some inspiring and others deeply destructive. The expansion of Greek culture forever transformed Jewish identity. Even those who resisted with all their strength could not prevent the Greek language, philosophy, and models of government from leaving an indelible mark. The mix of national pride and cultural openness that characterized this period would be key in the years to come. That crossroads between the legacy of Jerusalem and the influence of Athens prepared the ground for an explosion of tensions that would soon lead the Jewish people to one of the most decisive episodes in their history. A rebellion born from the depths of the people, from pain and from an unbreakable faith that their God and their customs could not be trampled without consequence. From Rome to Islam, the Maccabean revolt, that spark of resistance ignited against the cultural imposition of the Seleucids, made it clear that the people of Israel were willing to fight for their identity at any cost. The independence achieved after years of combat led to the creation of the Hasmonean dynasty, a brief period of autonomy that allowed them to finally breathe without the direct shadow of foreign powers. However, peace and independence are rarely eternal in this always coveted land. The gaze of a new emerging power, much larger and more determined than any before, was already fixed on the region: Rome. Rome's entry into the history of Judea did not come through a great battlefield victory, but through a combination of clever diplomacy, political opportunism, and the growing internal division among Jewish factions. In the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, disputes between different claimants to the Hasmonean throne offered General Pompey the perfect pretext to intervene. When his legions entered Jerusalem in the year 63 before the Common Era, they did so with Rome's characteristic pragmatism, imposing order but without completely dismantling local structures. Autonomy was reduced to a mirage. Judea became a client state of Rome, governed under the constant watch of Roman procurators. One of the most controversial figures of this era was Herod the Great. Appointed king by Rome, Herod managed to stay in power thanks to a blend of ruthless politics and monumental architectural projects. His physical legacy still remains. The expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem was one of the grandest works of its time, transforming the Temple Mount into a monumental esplanade that still dominates the city's skyline today. But Herod ruled over a territory divided between those who considered him a traitor in service of Rome and those who admired him for his works and ability to maintain stability. Tension was constant. The Jewish population lived trapped between political submission and the ever-present hope for redemption, whether from the heavens or from a human leader who would set them free. The situation worsened after Herod's death. Roman administration became more direct, more relentless, and more blind to the cultural and religious particularities of the Jewish people. The revolt finally erupted in the year 66 of the Common Era. It was an uprising fueled by decades of humiliation, excessive taxation, and symbolic desecrations that proved to be the final straw. The First Jewish-Roman War was a devastating conflict. Roman legions, led by generals like Vespasian and his son Titus, launched a campaign of systematic destruction. Resistance in Galilee was fierce. The defense of Jerusalem was desperate. and the end tragic. In the year 70, Roman troops captured the city and destroyed the Second Temple. Flames engulfed the most sacred place in Judaism, while thousands of inhabitants were massacred or sold into slavery. That wound marked the Jewish collective memory indelibly, leaving a scar that still aches today. But the story of resistance did not end there. Years later, in the year 132, a second major rebellion broke out, the Bar Kokhba revolt. It was a final hope, a desperate cry for freedom. For a brief time, the Jews managed to reclaim part of the territory and establish their own administration, but Rome responded with brutality beyond anything before. The repression was so severe that Jerusalem was left virtually empty of Jewish population. Hadrian, the emperor, decided to erase even the city's name, which was renamed Aelia Capitolina. The entire region was renamed Palestine, in a deliberate attempt to eradicate any reference to ancient Judea. Over time, the majority of the Jewish population was forced to live in the diaspora. They dispersed throughout the provinces of the empire, carrying with them their culture, sacred texts, and a hope that remained alive in daily prayers: the return to Zion. Life in the diaspora was not easy, but it did not mean the disappearance of their identity. On the contrary, religion reorganized. Synagogues replaced the temple as centers of community life, and the figure of the rabbi gained a central role that would define Judaism from then on. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Jerusalem continued to change. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire made an unexpected shift. Christianity, that faith born within the borders of Judea, became the official religion of the empire. Jerusalem, once a symbol of Jewish resistance, was now adorned with churches, and Christian pilgrims began arriving from all corners of the Roman world. The city became a focal point for the emerging Christianity, with a new spiritual meaning that had little to do with its Hebrew past. The construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sacred sites redefined the religious geography of the city. The already minimal Jewish presence was further restricted. Access to the Temple Mount was prohibited to them, and the image of Jerusalem began to take its place in Christian theology as the setting for the fulfillment of prophecies. With the fall of Rome in the west and the rise of the Byzantine Empire, Jerusalem remained under Christian control, although internal tensions persisted. Instability, doctrinal disputes, and threats of external invasions created a tense and shifting climate. Then, in the 7th century, something completely unexpected changed the balance of power in the region. From the Arabian desert arose a new force, a religious and military movement that, in just a few decades, would forever alter the political map of the Near East. Islam, under the guidance of Muhammad and his successors, spread at lightning speed. In the year 638, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem. It was a historic moment. Control of the city passed from Christian to Muslim hands. The entry of Umar was symbolically opposite to the Roman conquests. According to chronicles, the caliph showed special respect for the sacred sites and allowed the Christian population to remain in the city. The Muslims began building their own monuments, the most important of which was the Dome of the Rock, erected on the Temple Mount at the end of the 7th century. That golden dome, which centuries later would become one of Jerusalem's most recognizable symbols, marked the beginning of a new era. The arrival of Islam was not simply a change of rulers. It brought with it a new worldview, a new way of understanding the relationship between Jerusalem and the divine. For Islam, the city represents the place from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens during his night journey. Jerusalem's spiritual status was thus sealed as the 3rd holiest city in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. In less than 700 years, Jerusalem had passed through the hands of different empires, dynasties, and religions. The city had witnessed glories, collapses, tragedies, and constant renewals. And despite everything, it remained standing, like a silent witness watching from its hills the ebb and flow of history. What would come next was a new wave of conflict, this time marked by armies arriving from Europe, by bloodshed in the name of faith, and by the fierce struggle for control over every sacred stone that made up the heart of the city. The Crusades and the Jewish struggle. The echo of Muslim chants had barely settled into the stones of Jerusalem when a new chapter, brutal and bloody, began to be written. The news that the holy city was in the hands of Islam reached Europe as an unacceptable provocation for Christianity. And with that, one of the most impactful military and religious movements of the Middle Ages was set in motion: the Crusades. It was the year 1095 when Pope Urban II, from Clermont in France, issued a call to the Christian world. The mission was clear, at least on paper: to liberate Jerusalem and the holy sites from the hands of the infidels. But what followed was much more than a military campaign. It was a social phenomenon, an explosion of fanaticism, violence, and religious hope that mobilized tens of thousands of people, from nobles to peasants, from trained knights to individuals who had never held a weapon. The First Crusade began with an enthusiasm that bordered on the irrational. As the columns of crusaders advanced through Europe, the first to suffer the consequences of that fervor were the Jewish communities of the continent. In cities such as Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, pogroms broke out with a violence that seemed to have no limits. Enraged crowds, convinced they were fulfilling a divine mission, stormed Jewish neighborhoods, murdered men, women, and children, and destroyed synagogues. The logic was perverse. Before liberating Jerusalem, it was necessary to purify Europe of those considered enemies of Christ. For the Jews of Europe, those weeks were an unexpected nightmare. The threat did not come from foreign invaders, but from their own neighbors, from people with whom they had lived for generations. Insecurity, fear, and helplessness filled the days leading up to the departure of the Crusaders toward the east. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, life continued under Muslim rule. The Jews, who during previous centuries had experienced varying periods of tolerance under the Caliphate, maintained a discreet but constant presence in the city. However, in the summer of the year 1099, that relative calm was shattered. The arrival of the Crusaders at the gates of Jerusalem marked the beginning of a relentless siege. For weeks, the European troops, exhausted by heat and disease, surrounded the city, determined to take it at all costs. When the walls finally gave way, the carnage was absolute. The massacre did not distinguish between Muslims, Eastern Christians, or Jews. The entire population became victims of the fury unleashed by the conquerors. Accounts from the time describe nightmarish scenes. Men, women, and children were killed in the streets, in their homes, inside their own places of worship. The Jews, who had taken refuge in the main synagogue, were surrounded, locked in, and burned alive while the Crusaders celebrated their victory. The synagogue, a symbol of the community's continuity, was reduced to ashes. Christian chronicles, far from hiding these events, narrated them with a mixture of pride and devotion, as if the spilled blood were part of the necessary price to return the city to the true faith. The arrival of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem marked a complete change in the administration of the city. The holy sites were transformed according to the standards of Western Christianity. The Temple Mount, which until then had been home to Islamic monuments, became the headquarters of the Knights Templar. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque came to be used as Christian religious and military spaces. The Jewish population, decimated and scattered, was left outside Jerusalem for years. Some survivors took refuge in nearby cities such as Jericho or Hebron, while others sought new destinations in diaspora communities. The Jewish presence in the Holy Land was reduced to small groups living under the constant threat of persecution or expulsion. But even in the darkest moments, the struggle for survival and identity did not fade. The Jews continued to uphold their traditions, teach their language, and passed down their hope of someday returning to a Jerusalem free from violence and hatred. Letters from the time, written by rabbinical leaders, circulated among the scattered communities, asking for help, sending news, and strengthening the bonds of a people that, though battered, refused to disappear. The situation began to change in the year 1187, when Sultan Saladin, leader of the Ayyubids, undertook the reconquest of Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin, which meant a crushing defeat for the Crusaders, opened the way for the entrance of Muslim troops into the Holy City. Unlike the excessive brutality that the Crusaders had shown nearly a century earlier, Saladin chose to act with restraint. There was no massacre. There were no massive fires. The Christian population was allowed to leave after paying a ransom, and those who decided to stay did so under the protection of the new regime. For the Jewish community, Saladin's entry was seen as a liberation. For the first time in decades, the Jews were able to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their lives. The city, now under Islamic administration, offered more guarantees of safety and religious freedom than they had known during Crusader rule. However, the scars were deep. The demographic loss, psychological trauma, and destruction of communal institutions would be wounds that would take generations to heal. On a broader level, the Crusades had a lasting impact on the relationship between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The violence unleashed in the name of faith left a legacy of distrust and resentment that would shape the decades that followed. The Jews, caught between two worlds at war, learned to navigate amid the tensions, always seeking the delicate balance between survival and dignity. The Jewish struggle during the Crusades was not only a matter of physical confrontations. It was a cultural, spiritual, and psychological resistance against intolerance, fanaticism, and barbarity. Through prayer, clandestine education, and internal solidarity, the Jewish communities managed to preserve their identity in an environment seemingly designed to erase them from the map. The years passed, the Crusades continued, and Jerusalem changed hands several more times. But one thing had become clear. Each new conqueror, each new regime, each new attempt to rewrite the history of the city encountered in its stones, in its people, and in its collective memory a resistance that seemed impossible to extinguish. And when the era of the Crusades finally began to fade, another empire, another power, another chapter awaited on the horizon, ready to also leave its mark on the history of Jerusalem and on the destiny of the Jewish people. Jerusalem after the Crusades. The end of the Crusades did not bring the expected peace to Jerusalem. The city, witness to centuries of conflict, seemed doomed to live in a perpetual state of transition, as if its fate were written in strokes of conquest, broken promises, and new rulers who, one after another, fought over every street, every wall, and every sacred corner. When the last Crusader flags were taken down, absolute control remained, at least for a time, in the hands of the Ayyubids under the leadership of Saladin. Saladin, whose name had already spread across Europe as a synonym for cunning and chivalry, implemented a policy that in many ways contrasted with the brutality of his Christian predecessors. He opened the gates of Jerusalem to the Jewish people, allowing many families who had spent decades in exile to return to the city. This decision was not only an act of benevolence, it also responded to a political strategy aimed at repopulating the city and reactivating its economic and social life after the devastation of war. The following years were marked by slow reconstruction. The Muslim population returned to their old neighborhoods, Eastern Christians maintained a limited presence, and the Jewish community, although small, began to regroup around their traditional places of gathering and prayer. Daily life, marked by poverty and scarcity, was far from the splendor of previous eras, but little by little, the city regained some of its vital rhythm. However, stability was never complete. The death of Saladin in 1193 opened a period of political fragmentation within the Islamic world. The Ayyubid family divided into factions that began to compete for control of different regions. Jerusalem was caught in the middle of these dynastic conflicts. On several occasions, the city was handed over as a bargaining chip in political agreements, or fell under the control of leaders who could barely maintain internal order. Despite these turbulences, there were moments of relative balance. During these years, the Christian presence in Jerusalem never completely disappeared. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre continued to receive pilgrims, although in much smaller numbers than during the Crusader period. Monks and clergy from different branches of Christianity maintained a delicate balance with the Muslim authorities, trying to preserve their sacred spaces while avoiding provocations that could lead to reprisals. At the same time, the Jewish community was rebuilding its spiritual life. Small synagogues, schools for the study of the Torah, and modest shops began to appear around the Western Wall, the only visible remnant of the ancient temple still standing. The relationship between the different communities was tense, but the need for coexistence forced a fragile truce in everyday life. The next major transformation came with the arrival of the Mamluks in the 13th century. These former slave soldiers, who had managed to take control of Egypt and extend their influence over Syria and Palestine, imposed a militarized and, in many ways, relentless model of government. The Mamluks did not share the Ayyubids' interest in protecting religious minorities. Their administration was marked by a strong Islamization of public life and by restrictions that affected both Christians and Jewish people. During Mamluk rule, Jerusalem lost even more political relevance. The city was not made a regional capital, nor did it receive significant investments. It became, more than ever, a secondary city within an empire whose centers of power were located in Cairo and Damascus. However, paradoxically, this political decline allowed some space for local communities to continue their lives, away from the direct attention of central authority. Urban architecture also underwent a transformation. The Mamluks built madrasas, public fountains, and covered markets, many of which can still be seen today when walking through Jerusalem's Old City. Muslim pilgrimage routes were improved, and the Temple Mount regained a central role in Islamic spiritual life. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were renovated to restore their splendor, while reinforcing the Muslim identity of the city. For the Jewish people, life in Jerusalem during this period was difficult, but not impossible. The laws imposed by the Mamluks limited the number of synagogues allowed and restricted the clothing and legal rights of the Jewish population. But even so, the community survived by adapting to the circumstances. Wealthier families began to establish trade networks that allowed them to remain economically stable, while poorer families depended on aid sent by Jewish communities from the diaspora. One of the most interesting aspects of this period was the growing connection between Jerusalem and Jewish communities in North Africa, the emerging Ottoman Empire, and Europe. Letters, donations, and pilgrimages helped the city maintain its status as a spiritual center, even in times of deep marginalization. The symbolic presence of Jerusalem remained alive in the imagination of thousands of Jewish people who dreamed of returning, even if only through the prayers recited daily from places as distant as Fez, Alexandria, or Toledo. By the end of the 15th century, Jerusalem's situation was that of an exhausted city, with limited resources and under the administration of a Mamluk regime that was showing signs of decline. The total population barely reached a few thousand inhabitants, distributed among Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people, all of them trying to survive in a city that no longer had the brilliance or influence of earlier times. And in the midst of that context of decay and weariness, another profound transformation was about to arrive. From Anatolia, a new military and political power was rising, ready to sweep away the old structures of the region. The Ottoman Turks, with their expansive ambition and their ability to assimilate diverse territories, were beginning to look south, toward the lands of Syria and Palestine. The Ottoman conquest, which would soon materialize, would mark the beginning of a new historical cycle for Jerusalem, a period in which the city, although still small and peripheral, would reconnect with trade routes, administrative centers, and new cultural currents that would once again transform the lives of those who lived within its walls. the emergence of Zionism and the first Aliyah. For centuries, the yearning to return to Zion had been a constant emotional and spiritual theme within Judaism. Prayers, songs, and sacred texts had, for generations, remembered the loss of Jerusalem, evoking the promise of one day returning. But that desire, well into the 19th century, had remained in the realm of the symbolic, closer to liturgy than to concrete political action. The diaspora, scattered across the four corners of the earth, had learned to survive and adapt in often hostile environments, maintaining their faith but without a real strategy to turn that age-old dream into a tangible reality. However, something began to change as Europe moved toward modernity. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of nationalism, and the gradual collapse of the old empires transformed the political and social map of the continent. Amidst all these movements, anti-Semitism resurfaced with unexpected virulence. The pogroms in the Russian Empire, the legal restrictions in Central Europe, and the growing social hostility in countries where Jews had lived for centuries began to sow fear and despair. It was in this context of threats and broken hopes that modern Zionism was born. Not as a simple feeling of longing for the promised land, but as a political movement, organized and determined to turn into action what had for generations been only an aspiration. The ideas that fueled Zionism had many roots, but they all shared a common principle. The Jewish people needed a homeland of their own, a safe place where they could live free from persecution and in full possession of their rights. One of the first to articulate this idea was Leon Pinsker, a Russian physician and writer who, after witnessing massacres of Jews in his country, published an essay titled Auto-Emancipation. In its pages, Pinsker made an urgent call for the necessity of a Jewish state. His argument was clear. Integration into European society was an illusion. The only solution lay in reclaiming a land of their own. Pinsker's ideas began to circulate among young Jewish intellectuals and activists in Eastern Europe. But it was in Vienna that Zionism found its most charismatic and visionary leader. Theodor Herzl, a journalist and political observer, was deeply affected by the Dreyfus affair in France. The blatant injustice of that case, in which a Jewish officer was convicted of treason without solid evidence, convinced Herzl that total assimilation was impossible. Anti-Semitism, he believed, was not an anomaly. It was a constant. In the year 1897, Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in the city of Basel, Switzerland. There, representatives of Jewish communities from various countries met for the first time with a shared objective: to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Herzl knew the task would not be easy. The region was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and the European powers had conflicting interests in the area. But that Congress marked a turning point. Zionism was no longer just a school of thought. It had become a political movement with concrete goals. While theories were being discussed and committees formed in Europe, the process of return to Palestine had already begun, albeit modestly and often improvised. Between the years 1882 and 1904, what history knows as the first Aliyah took place. Aliyah means ascent, a word that reflects the spiritual and symbolic weight of the act of emigrating to the land of Israel. The first to arrive were, for the most part, Jews from the Russian Empire and from Romania, young men and women driven by a mix of idealism, necessity, and faith. Many of them had no experience in agriculture or physical labor, but they were willing to face the climate, diseases, and the extremely harsh conditions of a land that, at that time, was largely arid, poorly connected, and with minimal infrastructure. The first agricultural colonies arose more from willpower than from resources. Petah Tikva, Rishon LeZion, and Zikron Yaakov are among the names remembered as pioneers of that silent epic. The settlers faced every kind of problem: water shortages, infertile soil, and also a difficult coexistence with the local Arab population, who viewed the arrival of these new inhabitants with suspicion. The Ottoman Empire, which still controlled the region, imposed numerous administrative obstacles. Obtaining permits to buy land or to reside permanently in Palestine required patience, connections, and in many cases, bribes. However, despite the difficulties, the small Jewish communities began to grow. The social structure they built was based on principles of cooperation and mutual aid. Settlers shared tools, resources, and knowledge. The creation of the first agricultural cooperatives was a rehearsal for what, years later, would become the kibbutz model. One of the most notable aspects of the first Aliyah was the blend of realism and hope that inspired its participants. On one hand, they knew they were facing almost impossible conditions. On the other, they believed their effort carried a profound historical meaning. Every tree planted, every house built, and every child born in that land was seen as a concrete step toward the recovery of a national home. The international community, for the most part, viewed these movements with indifference or with a mix of skepticism and condescension. For many, the idea that the Jewish people could rebuild a nation after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion seemed little more than a fantasy. But the Zionists were not seeking external approval. They knew the path would be long and full of obstacles. The first Aliyah was only the beginning, a general rehearsal for what would come next. The foundations had been laid, small but firm. The immigration routes, the solidarity networks between the diaspora and the settlers, the conviction that the return was not just a dream, but a historical and moral right. All of this began to take shape in those years of quiet effort and labor under the relentless sun of Palestine. With time, new waves of immigration would continue to fuel that project. The second Aliyah, the third, and the ones that followed would bring social, political, and demographic changes that would definitively alter the future of the region. But that is another story, because while in the lands of Palestine the fields were beginning to bloom under the effort of those first immigrants, in Europe and in the great capitals of the world, international tensions and the interests of the great powers were slowly turning toward a much greater conflict, one that, though no one yet knew it, would drag the entire world into a war of unknown proportions. World War I and the British mandates. At the beginning of the 20th century, the map of the world seemed to be drawn with thick and rigid lines, marked by the power of empires that believed themselves to be eternal. Palestine remained a forgotten province within the vast body of the Ottoman Empire. Its dusty fields, agricultural villages, and its capital, Jerusalem, lived far removed from the bustle of European capitals, where political and military tensions were beginning to boil beneath the surface. The majority of the region's inhabitants, Muslim and Christian Arabs, lived off agriculture or small-scale trade. The Jewish community, although growing due to recent waves of migration, remained a minority trying to settle within a complex and inefficient administrative structure. But the apparent calm of Palestine would be abruptly broken by the outbreak of the First World War in the year 1914. That conflict, born from an assassination in Sarajevo, spread like an unstoppable storm across Europe and soon much of the world. The Ottomans, aligned with the Central Powers, found themselves at war with the United Kingdom and its allies. And although Palestine lay far from the trenches of Europe, its strategic position turned it into a first-order military and political objective. While armies fought in the Sinai Desert and the hills of Galilee, decisions were beginning to take shape in London that would forever change the destiny of Palestine. The most famous, and undoubtedly the most controversial, was the Balfour Declaration. In November of the year 1917, the British government, through a letter signed by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Arthur Balfour, expressed its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. That brief document, but with immeasurable consequences, was sent to Lord Rothschild, a prominent figure in the Zionist movement. The Balfour Declaration did not arise from a selfless humanitarian impulse. It was the result of a mixture of strategic calculations, geopolitical interests, and the hope that international Jewish support could tip the balance of the war in favor of the United Kingdom. In addition, the British were also seeking the backing of Jews in Russia and the United States, countries whose position in the conflict was crucial. But while London was promising a national home to the Jews, it was holding parallel conversations with Arab leaders to whom it offered support for the creation of a large independent Arab state if they rose up against Ottoman rule. The contradictions were evident, but in the midst of war, diplomatic commitments seemed more like short-term tools than binding promises for the future. On the ground, the military situation also progressed rapidly. Under the command of General Edmund Allenby, the British and British Empire troops, with the support of Arab forces led by figures such as Lawrence of Arabia, managed to break through the Ottoman lines. In December of the year 1917, Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, in a symbolic gesture intended to show respect for the Holy City. The entrance of the British Army marked the end of more than 4 centuries of Ottoman control. With the war over, the victorious powers divided up the former possessions of the Ottoman Empire through the Sykes-Picot agreements and the subsequent creation of mandates under the supervision of the League of Nations. Palestine was placed under British mandate. Beginning in the year 1920, the United Kingdom assumed civil and military administration of the territory, with the task, as stipulated, of preparing its inhabitants for self-government. But the ambiguities accumulated during the war began to explode in daily practice. The Arab population, which constituted the demographic majority, felt betrayed when they realized that the promise of independence had been sidelined in favor of the commitments made to the Zionist movement. For their part, Jewish leaders began to see the British mandate as a unique opportunity to advance the project of creating their own state. The decade of the year 1920s witnessed a series of growing tensions. On one hand, the Jewish migration waves, known as Aliyot, increased significantly. Entire families arrived from Eastern Europe, fleeing poverty, persecution, and violence. The Jewish Agency, an organization created to represent the Jewish community before the British authorities, organized the absorption of these new immigrants, facilitating their settlement on lands purchased from Arab landowners or through the creation of new agricultural colonies. On the other hand, the Arab population began to organize against what it perceived as an invasion. Tensions materialized in increasingly violent riots and clashes. One of the first major outbreaks was the Nebi Musa riot in the year 1920, followed by the uprisings of the year 1929, which culminated in the Hebron massacre, where dozens of members of the Jewish community were killed. The British administration, trapped between two communities with irreconcilable aspirations, attempted to maintain an impossible balance. White papers, that is, official policy documents, were implemented to try to limit Jewish immigration and calm Arab unrest. But these measures provoked outrage in the Zionist movement and failed to satisfy either side. Meanwhile, the Jewish Agency accelerated its efforts to strengthen the Jewish presence on the ground. New self-government institutions were created, Hebrew education was promoted, and self-defense forces such as the Haganah were consolidated. The infrastructure that, years later, would serve as the administrative and military backbone of the future state of Israel was beginning to take shape before everyone's eyes, though few at the time could imagine the final consequences. Palestine's economy also changed. The massive arrival of immigrants, along with financial investment from the Jewish diaspora, energized sectors such as agriculture, industry, and construction. Tel Aviv, founded as a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Jaffa, began to grow rapidly, becoming the first urban center with a Jewish majority. The British Mandate, which in its early years had seemed to be a project of stability and modernization, gradually turned into a political powder keg. Geostrategic interests, broken promises, and increasing waves of migration pushed the region into a dead end. Meanwhile, in Europe, a new threat was beginning to form in silence. The rise of totalitarian movements and the strengthening of ideologies that blamed the Jews for all the ills of society foreshadowed that the immediate future was going to be even darker. A shadow far denser than any regional conflict was beginning to loom over the entire world. The rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. At the beginning of the 1930s, the history of Europe seemed to sail through stormy waters where fear, frustration, and resentment were the strongest currents. The humiliation brought by the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, the recurring economic crises, and a growing sense of social despair had opened a crack in the heart of Germany. Through that crack, fueled by a fiercely effective propaganda machine, one of the darkest political movements in modern history began to grow: Nazism. Adolf Hitler, a figure who only a few years earlier had been little more than a fringe agitator, managed to transform a message of hatred into a mass political platform. The combination of extreme nationalism, aggressive anti-Semitism, and promises of national restoration resonated deeply with millions of Germans. In January of 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. With that, a chain of events began that would bring the continent and the world to the brink of the abyss. From the very beginning, the Nazi regime targeted the Jews as the internal enemy. The propaganda of the Third Reich, meticulously designed by experts in social manipulation, turned the image of the Jew into a symbol of everything Germany was told it must fight against: cultural decay, economic crisis, and political threat. Within months, laws began to be passed that excluded Jews from public life. The Nuremberg Laws, enacted in 1935, delivered a decisive blow. They stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or having relations with those considered to be of Aryan blood. The humiliations were daily, systematic, and planned. Businesses were shut down, teachers expelled, doctors banned, and children insulted in schools. The warning signs were evident, but for many, both inside and outside Germany, it was hard to believe that such hatred could lead to something worse. On the night of the 9th of November, 1938, the next major step in the spiral of violence occurred. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, marked the beginning of a new phase. Synagogues were set on fire, the windows of Jewish-owned shops were smashed, and thousands of people were arrested arbitrarily. While all of this was unfolding in the heart of Europe, in Palestine, the Jewish community continued to grow. Many of those who managed to escape from Germany and other Central European countries saw immigration to the Holy Land as their only chance for survival. However, the restrictions imposed by the British Mandate, increasingly pressured by the demands of the local Arab population, severely limited the number of immigrants who could legally enter. International tension escalated with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, an act that officially marked the beginning of the Second World War. What followed surpassed any nightmare. As the German armies advanced through Eastern Europe, millions of Jews fell under their control. What initially seemed like simple measures of segregation and deportation quickly turned into a systematic and meticulously executed plan of extermination. The final solution, as cynically named by the Nazis, meant the industrialization of death. Concentration camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek became centers of mass execution. Trains loaded with men, women, and children arrived daily at the unloading ramps. The vast majority of the newly arrived were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those few selected for forced labor survived only a few weeks or months before succumbing to malnutrition, disease, or the brutality of the guards. The magnitude of the Holocaust is difficult to grasp even today. 6 million Jews were murdered in less than a decade. Entire communities, with centuries of history, vanished overnight. Neighborhoods, synagogues, schools, and cultural centers were left empty, reduced to dust, or turned to rubble. Jewish culture, language, and life across much of Central and Eastern Europe were wiped out in a deliberate effort to erase the existence of a people. Meanwhile, in Palestine, news of what was happening in Europe arrived in fragments. Communication was slow and unclear, but every piece of information increased the desperation of families awaiting word from loved ones trapped on the other side of the Mediterranean. The Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, organized aid committees, pressured the British government to allow broader immigration, and in some cases launched clandestine rescue missions to save those who could escape. British policy, however, remained restrictive. The White Paper of 1939, approved just before the outbreak of the war, limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to a ridiculously low number, precisely when more lives were at stake than ever before. The doors of many countries, not only under the mandate but throughout the world, were closed to Jewish refugees. That combination of desperation, helplessness, and political betrayal was etched into the Jewish memory as a scar impossible to erase. When, in 1945, Allied troops liberated the concentration camps, images of the survivors, reduced to living skeletons, spread across the globe. The magnitude of the horror forced a re-evaluation of the very concepts of civilization, morality, and human rights. The Nuremberg trials attempted to set a legal precedent, but for millions of Jews, the loss was irreparable. Entire families had vanished. Entire communities had ceased to exist. The Holocaust was not only a human tragedy of enormous proportions, it was also an emotional and political catalyst that irreversibly transformed the course of the Zionist cause. The idea of a state of their own was no longer merely a hope. It had become an urgent necessity for collective survival. And as Europe struggled to recover from the physical and moral ruins of war, the situation in Palestine began to grow dramatically tenser. The combination of clandestine migration, confrontations with British authorities, and a growing wave of violence pointed toward an inevitable outcome, one that would mark the next and crucial chapter in the history of Israel. The birth of the State of Israel. When the Second World War came to an end, the entire world was faced with a mixture of relief and horror. The defeat of Nazism had closed a chapter of unrestrained violence, but the full revelation of the Holocaust left humanity in a state of disbelief and collective guilt. The figure of 6 million murdered Jews was not just a statistical fact. It was brutal evidence that, even in the heart of modern and civilized Europe, barbarism could be reborn with devastating force. While the victorious countries were rebuilding their cities and redefining the international order, the issue of Jewish refugees became impossible to ignore. Hundreds of thousands of survivors wandered through displaced persons camps in Germany, Poland, and other parts of Central Europe. Without homes, without families, and in many cases without documentation, those men and women were the last living witnesses of a tragedy that seemed to have no end. In Palestine, the situation was equally explosive. Migration pressure intensified day after day. Despite British restrictions, thousands of Jews tried to reach the Palestinian shores aboard improvised ships, risking their lives in journeys that often ended in shipwrecks or detentions. Images of refugees piled up in ports, rejected by the authorities of the British Mandate, began to circulate around the world, generating a wave of international sympathy for the Zionist cause. The Jewish Agency, led by figures such as David Ben-Gurion, understood that the decisive moment had arrived. Diplomacy and social mobilization intensified. In parallel, armed groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi began increasing their acts of sabotage and resistance against British rule. The military operations, which ranged from the destruction of key infrastructure to targeted attacks on British forces, aimed at a clear goal: accelerating the British withdrawal from Palestine. The climate of violence grew unchecked. Tension between Jews and Arabs reached unprecedented levels. Street clashes, attacks on convoys, and riots in major cities became part of daily life. The British authorities, unable to control the situation and pressured by internal public opinion, announced in February of 1947 their decision to transfer the issue of Palestine to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations, still in its early years of existence, accepted the challenge. A special committee was formed to study the situation and propose a viable solution. After months of debates, inspection trips, and interviews with representatives of both communities, on the 29th of November of 1947, Resolution number 181 was put to a vote. The plan proposed the partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem under international administration. The vote was tense, dramatic, and followed with enormous anticipation around the world. When the necessary votes for the partition were finally reached, the streets of the Jewish communities erupted in celebration. For the first time in over 2,000 years, the existence of a Jewish state in the ancestral land seemed to be one step away from becoming a reality. But the reaction of the Arab leadership was completely different. The resolution was immediately rejected. For the neighboring Arab countries and for the Palestinian representatives, the partition plan was seen as an intolerable injustice, a Western imposition that stripped the local Arab population of their legitimate right to the land. In the months that followed, the violence intensified even further. Clashes between communities reached the level of civil war. Convoys between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv were regularly attacked, and rural areas turned into improvised battlegrounds. As always in such cases, the civilian population paid the highest price. With the official end of the British Mandate approaching, the Jewish Agency accelerated preparations for the inevitable. Documents were drafted, lines of communication with international allies were established, and the basic mechanisms of government were organized for a state that did not yet exist, but had already become unavoidable. On the 14th of May of 1948, in Tel Aviv, in a modest yet symbolically charged room, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. The transmission was followed by radio throughout the country. Those present, aware of the historic moment they were witnessing, stood up to hear the text that declared the right of the Jewish people to establish themselves as a free and sovereign nation in their ancestral land. The document referenced the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the suffering endured during the diaspora, and the recent horror of the Holocaust. It promised equal rights for all inhabitants of the new state, regardless of religion, race, or gender. And it extended a call to neighboring Arab countries to seek peace and coexistence. But the response was immediate and forceful. As soon as the British Mandate officially ended, at dawn on the 15th of May, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq crossed the borders of the newly born state of Israel. The war was no longer internal. It had become a regional conflict. The Jewish people, who had barely had time to celebrate the birth of their state, were forced to enter a fight for survival from the very first day of their existence as a nation. The weapons that had been secretly stored for years began to be distributed. Young people, many of them recent immigrants, without prior military training and still carrying the trauma of the Holocaust in their skin, enlisted en masse to defend what had been achieved. What was at stake was not merely a territory. It was the continuity of a people who, after centuries of persecution and exile, had finally found a place of their own. But that place, far from being a peaceful refuge, would become, from the very first minute of its existence, the epicenter of one of the most complex, long-lasting, and emotionally charged conflicts in modern history. The war for Israel's survival. The dawn of May 15, 1948, did not bring the calm or euphoria that any new state might have hoped for on its first day of existence. While in the streets of Tel Aviv, some were still removing the flags and improvised decorations that had adorned the Declaration of Independence just hours earlier, radar stations and watch posts were already reporting what was about to happen. The armies of 5 Arab countries were beginning to mobilize toward the borders of the newborn state of Israel. Egypt advanced from the south, Syria from the northeast, Transjordan, later known as Jordan, moved its troops toward Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, while Lebanon and Iraq also joined the offensive. The situation was dramatic. Israel had only a few thousand poorly equipped soldiers, many with weapons that were second or even third-hand, often from dismantled arsenals from the Second World War. In many cases, they were of different calibers and not even compatible with one another. Ammunition was scarce, armored vehicles were improvised, and the Air Force was practically non-existent. But the human factor played a decisive role. The entire population understood, from the very first moment, that this was not merely a conventional war. It was a fight for survival, to prevent the dream just achieved from ending in another catastrophe. Thousands of men and women, many of them recent immigrants, volunteered to fight. Some arrived directly from European refugee camps. Others had grown up in Palestine under the British Mandate, but all shared the conviction that if Israel fell, there would be no second chance. The first days of the conflict were chaotic. Defense lines were improvised, and orders were transmitted however possible across the different fronts. In Jerusalem, the situation was especially critical. The city was divided by the advance of the Arab Legion of Transjordan, one of the best-trained armies in the region, commanded by British officer John Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha. The Jewish neighborhoods of the old city were besieged. The civilian population suffered from shortages, water cuts, and the constant threat of snipers. Despite everything, the Jewish militias, which would later form the foundation of the Israel Defense Forces, began to organize with surprising discipline. The Haganah, until then a clandestine self-defense force, became the core of the regular army. Its fighters, many without any prior military experience, learned in real time, adapting to every ambush, every enemy advance, and every forced retreat. International aid, although limited, began to arrive in the most desperate moments. Ships carrying weapons from Czechoslovakia broke through blockades and crossed the Mediterranean, bringing rifles, ammunition, and some obsolete airplanes that were nevertheless essential in establishing even a minimal air presence. The newly created Israeli Air Force, composed of volunteer pilots from various countries, carried out its first missions with planes that, under other circumstances, would have served only for training. Meanwhile, on the southern front, the Egyptian army advanced toward Tel Aviv. Israeli troops, in a desperate maneuver, managed to halt their progress in the Battle of Ashdod, an unexpected victory that changed the course of the campaign in that area. In the north, forces defending Galilee had to face Lebanese troops and irregular Arab units. The lines were fragile, and every hilltop, every road junction became a crucial battlefield. One of the most dramatic episodes was the fight for control of the road to Jerusalem. The city was on the verge of collapse due to the siege imposed by Arab forces. Convoys attempting to bring supplies were constantly ambushed. The highway connecting Tel Aviv to the capital became the scene of bloody clashes. In response, Israeli engineers and volunteers built, in record time, an alternative route through the hills, the so-called Burma Road, a narrow and rudimentary path that allowed the siege to be broken and food, weapons, and medicine to reach the defenders of Jerusalem. The international community watched the development of the conflict with a mixture of concern and diplomatic paralysis. The United Nations, which had just finished drafting the partition resolution, sent mediators to try to stop the violence, but each attempt at a ceasefire was broken almost immediately. The fragility of the armistice was such that the truces seemed more like technical pauses than true opportunities for negotiation. By mid-1948, after weeks of nearly uninterrupted fighting, the outlook began to change. Israel, which had initially found itself at a clear disadvantage, began to regain ground. The armed forces, increasingly better organized and equipped, launched coordinated offensives to repel the invaders. Operation Dani and Operation Yoav were examples of how the young state was beginning to master the terrain, both militarily and strategically. By the end of the year, Israel had not only managed to survive, but had consolidated control over much of the territory assigned to it by the United Nations resolution. It even expanded its borders beyond what had been stipulated, in part as a response to the Arab invasion. The armistice agreements signed in 1949 with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria brought a halt, at least temporarily, to open hostilities. But the human consequences of the war were devastating. More than 7,000 Israelis lost their lives, a massive number for a country with just over 600,000 inhabitants. On the other side, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting. The event known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, was etched into the memory of the Arab world as a chapter of pain and mass displacement. Israel had survived. Against all odds, it had defended its existence and secured its place on the world's political map. But peace was still far away. The wounds left by that first conflict would become the starting point for a long chain of wars, intifadas, failed negotiations, and tensions that would reach, as a bitter legacy, into our own time. And as refugees crossed borders, politicians signed truces, and military leaders took stock of what had occurred, the state of Israel began to look forward, building its institutions, welcoming new immigrants, and facing, without pause, the next challenge that history already had in store. Turning point in the Middle East. The state of Israel had barely had time to consolidate its existence when it became clear that the truce signed after the War of Independence was only a temporary pause in a long chain of conflicts. During the 1950s, the region breathed under a tense calm, a kind of collective waiting in which all the actors seemed to know that the next confrontation was not a matter of if it would happen, but when. The rivalry with Egypt became the center of attention very early on. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a charismatic leader and symbol of Pan-Arabism, made the struggle against Israel one of the pillars of both his domestic and foreign policies. The nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 was the first major trigger of a new war. The United Kingdom and France, seeing their commercial interests threatened, found in Israel an unexpected ally. The Israeli offensive was swift and forceful. The forces of the young state crossed the Sinai and reached the canal in just a few days. However, international pressure, led by the United States and the Soviet Union, forced an Israeli withdrawal in exchange for security guarantees and the deployment of an international peacekeeping force in the Sinai. The brief military success brought with it a shared sense of vulnerability throughout the country. Israeli defense policy began to transform. Disproportionate resources, relative to the size of the country, were invested in modernizing the armed forces, developing the military industry, and creating intelligence networks capable of anticipating any future threat. The doctrine of preventive offense began to gain ground among strategists, an idea that would become a reality with far-reaching consequences a decade later. By the mid-1960s, the signs of a new conflict became impossible to ignore. Border clashes in the Golan Heights with Syria, Egypt's closure of the Strait of Tyran, and the buildup of Arab troops along Israel's borders painted a scenario that seemed to lead, with no possible alternative, toward open war. The Six-Day War, in June of 1967, was the inevitable result of that accumulation of tensions. Israel, aware that a simultaneous war on three fronts could be lethal, decided to act first. The preemptive strike against the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces destroyed the majority of enemy aircraft before they could even take off. On the ground, Israeli armored columns advanced with a speed that surprised both their own generals and the international community. In just 6 days, the political map of the Middle East changed completely. Israel took control of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The recovery of Jerusalem and access, for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, to the Western Wall provoked scenes of national emotion that were etched into the country's collective memory. Soldiers, citizens, and political leaders cried publicly upon touching those ancient stones. But behind the euphoria, the political and military reality presented a much greater challenge. Israel now found itself in control of territories that not only increased its land area, but also brought over 1 million Palestinians under its administration. The question of what to do with those territories became the new dilemma that would divide Israeli politics for the decades to come. The international response came quickly. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 proposed the now well-known formula of land for peace. The logic seemed simple. Israel would return the conquered territories, and in exchange, the Arab states would recognize its right to exist within secure borders. But theory and practice, once again in the history of the Middle East, followed very different paths. The Arab countries gathered at the Khartoum conference shortly after the conflict took a firm stance. There would be no recognition, no negotiations, and no peace with Israel. The possibility of a political agreement was, at least at that moment, completely blocked. The impact of the war was felt in all the capitals involved. For the Arab world, the defeat was a blow to national pride and to the narrative of pan-Arabism that Nasser had promoted for years. For Israel, the victory marked a strategic turning point, but it also opened a new front of conflict: the administration of the occupied territories and the relationship with the Palestinian population. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which until then had had a limited political presence, began to gain prominence. Guerrilla actions and attacks on Israeli interests multiplied both inside and outside the borders. Airplane hijackings, commando operations, and bombings became a strategy of asymmetric warfare aimed at bringing the conflict to international attention. At the same time, the Cold War cast its shadow over the region. The Soviet Union reinforced its support for the Arab countries, while the United States consolidated its alliance with Israel, not only at the diplomatic level, but also militarily. The global ideological polarization began to be reflected in every decision made in the Middle East. During those years, Israel invested in developing new defensive capabilities. The expansion of its military arsenal, the professionalization of its army, and the creation of highly effective intelligence services were some of the measures adopted to face a threat that, far from disappearing, was becoming increasingly sophisticated and diverse. Thus, a new unstable balance was established. A scenario in which every movement, every speech, and every local confrontation could have far-reaching international repercussions. Israel, strengthened but more exposed than ever, was preparing to face a cycle of wars and diplomatic crises that, one after another, would go on to shape the changing face of the conflict in the years to come. The rise of Israel. The military victory of 1967 left Israel in an unexpected position. In just 6 days, the small state that for nearly 2 decades had lived under the constant threat of annihilation had come to control territories that tripled its original size. The territorial expansion was not merely a change on the maps. It represented a profound transformation in the country's collective psychology, in its political strategy, and in its way of relating to the rest of the world. The control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights represented, for much of the Israeli population, a kind of historical redemption. The recovery of places loaded with biblical symbolism, such as Hebron or Bethlehem, reignited a sense of ancestral connection with the land that many considered the spiritual core of the Jewish people. The streets of Jerusalem, where entire generations had dreamed of walking freely, were now open. The emotion that swept the country was undeniable, but after that initial euphoria, a much more complex and dilemma-filled process began. Administering territories with a large Palestinian population, one that never accepted the Israeli presence as legitimate, became a daily challenge. Internal debates began to divide Israeli society. Some sectors advocated for the permanent annexation of the conquered territories, arguing historical, religious, and security reasons. Others warned that maintaining control over a population without granting them full rights would eventually lead to a moral and political crisis of immeasurable proportions. Meanwhile, On the economic front, Israel began to experience growth that surprised many international observers. Financial aid from the United States increased significantly. Agricultural exports diversified, and the emerging technology industry was beginning to take its first steps. Tel Aviv and Haifa became industrial hubs, while Jerusalem, beyond its political and spiritual role, continued to solidify itself as a symbol of national unity. Immigration, as in previous stages, remained a key driver of demographic growth. Jewish people from the Soviet Union, from North African countries, from Latin America, and from Western Europe, arrived in Israel in waves that profoundly reshaped the country's social fabric. The mix of cultures, languages, and customs created a fascinating human mosaic, but it also brought tensions. The differences between Jewish people of European origin, known as Ashkenazi, and those coming from Arab countries, the Mizrahi, began to become apparent. The distribution of job opportunities, access to education, and cultural differences generated a climate of discontent in certain sectors that, over time, would translate into political demands for greater equality. At the same time, the settlement movement began to take shape. Religious and nationalist organizations started establishing small communities in the West Bank, often with tacit or explicit support from the government. These settlements, which at first appeared to be isolated initiatives, grew and consolidated until they became one of the most controversial issues in Israeli politics in the following decades. The Jewish presence in occupied territories was viewed by the Palestinians as a provocation and an illegal occupation, while for many Israelis it represented the logical continuation of a millennia-old history. Israel's foreign policy also underwent a substantial shift. After the Six-Day War, the country's image changed dramatically on the international stage. That small nation surrounded by enemies and fighting for its existence came to be seen as a military power, capable of defeating several Arab states in a single campaign. Relations with the United States grew even closer. Military, economic, and technological cooperation reached unprecedented levels. Washington began to see Israel as a key strategic ally on the geopolitical board of the Cold War. But this rise was not without cost. Israel's position on the international stage began to deteriorate among non-aligned countries and much of the Arab world. The narrative of occupation, the growth of settlements, and the constant clashes with the Palestinian population generated a growing wave of criticism. The United Nations, which in its early years had supported the creation of the State of Israel, began to adopt resolutions condemning the policy of occupation and calling for the withdrawal from the conquered territories. Within the country, social tensions continued to build. The differences between the secular population and the religious sectors began to polarize public debate. The role of the army in civilian life, mandatory military service, and the fate of the occupied territories were issues that filled the pages of newspapers and the speeches of parliamentarians. The Knesset, the Israeli parliament, became an ideological battleground where the country's future was debated with a passion that at times bordered on confrontation. Meanwhile, the youth were growing up under the weight of a civic education that combined national pride with a constant sense of external threat. The soldiers of the next generations, born after independence, were being trained on the same hills where their parents and grandparents had fought, but now with a more pragmatic and technological view of warfare. On the cultural front, Israel experienced a notable flourishing. Literature, music, and cinema began to explore not only the classic themes of war and survival, but also the internal contradictions, moral dilemmas, and identity tensions of an increasingly complex society. Modern Hebrew, established as the national language, served as a bridge for a diverse population seeking to build a shared narrative, although not always succeeding in reaching consensus. The 1970s were approaching, and with them, new challenges loomed on the horizon. Tensions with Egypt and Syria, far from dissipating, were increasing day by day. Israeli intelligence services were beginning to intercept troubling signals. Troop movements, military exercises near the borders, and a change in tone in the official speeches of Arab leaders. Everything indicated that the time of relative stability was coming to an end, and that a new conflict of unpredictable dimensions could erupt at any moment. Geopolitical struggles of Israel. The dawn of the 1970s found Israel at a complex crossroads. On one hand, the country had just consolidated its territorial position after the overwhelming victory of the Six-Day War. On the other, the regional balance, far from having stabilized, showed clear signs that a new storm was on the way. The confidence that military success had sown in the population began to dangerously blend with a sense of invulnerability that would soon be abruptly shattered. The Yom Kippur War in October of 1973 was the wake-up call no one in Israel expected. During the most solemn religious holiday on the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a large-scale surprise attack. The Israeli forces, until then considered unbeatable, were caught completely off guard. In the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, the first hours of the conflict were marked by chaotic retreats, territorial losses, and a sense of vulnerability that spread like lightning throughout the country. The Israeli response was swift. By mobilizing its entire draft-age population in record time, Israel managed to reorganize its defensive lines. At an extremely high human cost, Israeli troops regained lost ground and even crossed the Suez Canal, encircling the Egyptian Third Army and advancing toward Damascus on the northern front. However, the war, though it ended with militarily favorable terms for Israel, left an emotional and political wound that would change the face of the country for years. The loss of life was devastating. More than 2,500 Israeli soldiers died in combat, and the entire country entered a process of national introspection. The image of military infallibility that Israel had projected for years was shattered. Israeli society, accustomed to swift and overwhelming victories, had to confront for the first time the fragility of its own existence. On the geopolitical level, the Yom Kippur War had effects that transcended regional borders. The oil crisis, triggered by the embargo imposed by Arab countries on Israel's allies, caused a global economic earthquake. The price of crude oil skyrocketed, and the world economy entered a stage of recession that affected millions of people across all continents. Suddenly, the conflict in the Middle East ceased to be a regional issue and became a problem that directly impacted the daily lives of citizens in Paris, New York, or Tokyo. On the diplomatic front, Israel began to understand that its long-term survival could not rely solely on military strength. The need to build strategic alliances became an absolute priority. The relationship with the United States, already close, reached a new level. American military aid increased significantly, turning Israel into one of the top recipients of military assistance in the world. Fighter jets, missile defense systems, and cutting-edge technology began to flow into the country, strengthening its capacity to respond to future threats. But Israel's geopolitical struggle was not fought only on the military field. The battle for international legitimacy, for public image, and for control of the historical narrative became a front just as critical as any physical border. In the United Nations, the bloc of Arab countries and their allies began to promote resolutions condemning the occupation of territories and questioning Israel's foreign policy. The infamous Resolution 3379, passed in 1975, went so far as to equate Zionism with a form of racism. A declaration that Israel fought diplomatically for years until it was repealed in the following decade. Within the country, the 1970s were also a time of social upheaval. Distrust in the political elites, the emergence of new grassroots movements, and growing criticism of the historical leadership of the Labour Party marked the beginning of a transition that, in 1977, would cause a political earthquake. For the first time since the founding of the state, the left was removed from power, and the Likud party, led by Menachem Begin, came to government. The change was not merely in leadership. It represented a deep transformation in the national vision regarding security, borders, and foreign relations. The new administration adopted a much firmer stance on the permanence in the occupied territories and openly favored the expansion of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. For many, this policy was a way to guarantee the country's future security. For others, it was the seed of future conflicts that would inevitably erupt again sooner or later. During those years, the Palestinian conflict took an increasingly international turn. The Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, intensified its actions. Attacks in airports, airplane hijackings, and assaults on Israeli targets abroad became frequent headlines in the international press. The massacre of Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympic Games in 1972 was perhaps the most media-covered and symbolic episode of this new phase of the conflict. Israel's response to these attacks was swift and uncompromising. Retaliatory operations such as the one known as Wrath of God led Mossad agents and members of the special unit Sayeret Matkal to operate on foreign soil to eliminate those responsible for the attacks. The policy of active self-defense became a distinctive mark of Israel's security strategy, a doctrine that prioritized deterrence and prevention through direct action. At the same time, the Israeli economy underwent significant transformations. Investment in research and development began to bear its first fruits. The technological industry, which in later decades would earn Israel the nickname Startup Nation, found its foundations in those years of tension and uncertainty. Scientific education, the strengthening of the university sector, and collaboration with technological centers in the United States set in motion a machine that would later transform the economic landscape of the country. But despite those internal advances, the geopolitical struggles continued to shape daily life. The Palestinian question was becoming increasingly complex. Settlements were expanding, international resolutions were piling up, and protests, both internal and external, were on the rise. The situation had turned into a political and diplomatic labyrinth where every move could have unpredictable consequences. And while the world's foreign ministries multiplied their initiatives to seek a negotiated solution, the clock of history kept ticking forward. New international players were beginning to intervene in the region, and the successive Israeli governments, with their differing approaches, faced again and again the same dilemma: how to guarantee the security of the country without becoming trapped in an eternal conflict from which it seemed impossible to emerge without paying an unbearably high price. The Camp David and Jordan peace agreements. After years of wars, border conflicts, and international tension that kept the Middle East at the center of the world stage, the end of the 1970s brought a shift that very few would have imagined just a decade earlier. After countless fiery speeches, military maneuvers, and promises never to negotiate, two of the region's fiercest enemies began to take the first steps toward a historic reconciliation that would deeply and permanently change the balance of power in the area. The figure who broke the diplomatic deadlock was Anwar el-Sadat, president of Egypt. After the Yom Kippur War of the year 1973, in which Egypt partially regained its military dignity despite the final defeat, Sadat realized that continuing down the path of perpetual confrontation would doom his country to economic ruin and international isolation. Egypt's economy was on the brink of collapse. Public morale was eroded, and internal pressure was becoming unbearable. In a move as unexpected as it was bold, Sadat announced in November of the year 1977 his decision to visit Jerusalem. The image of the Egyptian leader stepping off the plane on Israeli soil and being received by the then Prime Minister Menahem Begin became etched into the collective memory of the entire region. It was a gesture that unleashed both admiration and fury. While many in Israel celebrated the possibility of real peace with the largest country in the Arab world, the reaction in neighboring capitals was one of absolute rejection. Sadat was accused of treason by much of the Arab leadership, but he pressed forward. International diplomacy then played a key role. The President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, took on the role of direct mediator and invited both parties to Camp David, the official retreat of American presidents. For 12 days in September of the year 1978, in an atmosphere of forced confinement but intense dialogue, Sadat, Begin, and Carter led one of the most complex and emotionally draining negotiations in recent history. The debates were tough, with crises that threatened to break off the talks more than once. Decades of accumulated distrust, the fresh memory of thousands of dead on both sides, and the pressure of national public opinion constantly weighed on the leaders. But after endless days of discussion, an agreement emerged. Egypt would officially recognize the State of Israel, becoming the first Arab country to do so, and in return, Israel would commit to a complete withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, returning control of the territory to Egypt. The Camp David Accords represented far more than a simple exchange of territory for diplomatic recognition. They were tangible proof that, even in a context poisoned by violence and resentment, understanding was possible if there was enough political will. For Israel, it meant strategic relief. For the first time since its founding, one of its borders was secured through a formal peace treaty. The process culminated in March of the year 1979 with the official signing of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in Washington. Images of Sadat and Begin shaking hands under the watchful eye of an emotional Jimmy Carter were broadcast around the world. The return of Sinai was implemented in the following years, with the progressive evacuation of Israeli settlements and the dismantling of military infrastructure. It was one of the few times in the history of the conflict where a diplomatic agreement led to a tangible and verifiable territorial change. But Egypt's decision came at a high cost. Sadat was harshly punished both internally and across the Arab world. Isolated by his former allies, Egypt was expelled from the Arab League, and its president became the target of extremist groups who accused him of surrendering to the Zionist enemy. Finally, in October of the year 1981, during a military parade in Cairo, Sadat was assassinated by members of a radical Islamist group. His death closed a chapter, but the peace between Egypt and Israel, despite ups and downs, has endured to this day. The experience of Camp David had a domino effect in the region, although not always in the direction many had hoped. For years, the rest of the Arab countries remained firm in their refusal to recognize Israel, but the seed of diplomacy had been planted. A decade later, another Arab country would follow the same path: Jordan. The relationship between Israel and Jordan had always been ambiguous and full of nuances. Although the two countries had fought in several wars, secret contacts between their intelligence services and political representatives were never completely severed. King Hussein of Jordan, a pragmatic monarch aware of his country's limitations, understood that a formal peace with Israel could bring economic, political, and security benefits. The process that led to the peace treaty of the year 1994 was long and shaped by the international context. The Gulf War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the opening of the Oslo process with the Palestinians created a favorable environment for moving toward an agreement. The official signing took place on October 26, 1994, at the border between the two countries, with President Bill Clinton present as a witness. The agreement included mutual recognition, the establishment of full diplomatic relations, cooperation on water, trade, and tourism, and a joint commitment to the fight against terrorism. Peace with Jordan represented another decisive step in Israel's integration into the region. Although the treaty was never particularly popular among the Jordanian population, the maintenance of formal relations between the two countries helped to reduce tensions and to avoid military escalations that, in the past, would have been almost inevitable. Israel, after decades of isolation and confrontation, began to break through the diplomatic wall that surrounded it. Peace with Egypt and Jordan did not resolve the Palestinian conflict nor bring a definitive solution to the ongoing territorial disputes, but it demonstrated that dialogue, even between historic enemies, was possible. With these advancements, the country entered a new phase in its history, a stage where diplomacy, bilateral agreements, and secret negotiations would begin to play an increasingly important role, even as tensions with other neighbors and with the Palestinians continued to grow at an unstoppable pace. wars in Lebanon, and northern security. By the mid-1970s, while Israel was enjoying a certain calm following the wars in the south and the first outlines of peace treaties, the northern part of the country was gradually becoming a front that threatened to once again destabilize the military and emotional balance of the nation. The border with Lebanon, until then a secondary concern in Israel's defense strategy, turned into a hot zone where sporadic gunfire, artillery attacks, and commando infiltrations began to shape the daily rhythm of life for communities in the north. The Palestine Liberation Organization, after being expelled from Jordan in 1970, had found fertile ground in southern Lebanon to reorganize and launch its campaign of attacks against Israel. From border towns and makeshift camps, the PLO carried out a constant offensive that affected kibbutzim, small cities, and civilian settlements in Galilee. Katyusha rocket attacks, armed raids, and roadside bombings turned life in northern Israel into a routine of sudden alerts, air raid shelters, and funerals. Israel's response during those first years consisted of rapid incursions aimed at destroying Palestinian positions in southern Lebanon. These were surgical operations, limited in scope and duration, intended to dismantle militant cells before they could establish more stable infrastructure. But as PLO activity increased and the Lebanese state, engulfed in a devastating civil war, was unable to exert real control over its own territory, the situation became unsustainable. In June of 1982, following an assassination attempt against the Israeli ambassador in London and under the justification of protecting its civilian population, Israel launched what would become its most ambitious military operation since the Six-Day War. Operation Peace for Galilee aimed not only to expel the PLO from southern Lebanon, but also to bring about a profound political shift in the internal balance of the neighboring country. Columns of Israeli tanks advanced quickly, supported by airstrikes and artillery, engaging both Palestinian fighters and Syrian army units deployed in the region. The battle for control of Beirut, a city already devastated by years of civil war, became one of the most intense and controversial episodes of the conflict. For weeks, the Lebanese capital was subjected to constant bombardment as Israeli forces and allied Christian militias sought to drive the PLO from its urban strongholds. The siege of Beirut ended with the forced evacuation of the PLO, whose leaders, including Yasser Arafat, left the city under the supervision of international forces. However, the conflict left a deep scar. The massacre at Sabra and Shatila, in which Christian militiamen, operating with the tacit approval of Israeli troops, killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians in refugee camps, triggered a wave of global condemnation. In Israel, the protests were massive. The Kahan Commission, established to investigate the events, held Ariel Sharon, then Minister of Defense, politically responsible, which led to his resignation. Despite the criticism and growing international pressure, Israel maintained a military presence in southern Lebanon for the following years. A security zone was established, controlled by the South Lebanon Army, a local militia funded and trained by Israel. The goal was to create a buffer zone to prevent attacks from once again reaching Israeli towns. But the reality proved quite different. The Israeli military presence became a constant target for clashes, ambushes, and improvised explosive device attacks. It was in this context of occupation and resistance that a new actor emerged, one that would become, over time, one of Israel's most sophisticated and persistent threats: Hezbollah. Originating from the Shiite community in southern Lebanon, the movement was backed from the start by Iran and Syria, both politically and militarily. Unlike the PLO, which was more secular and nationalist in nature, Hezbollah incorporated a religious dimension into its struggle, framing its resistance as a sacred duty and declaring the expulsion of Israel from Lebanese soil as its central objective. During the 1990s, Hezbollah's activity grew steadily and methodically. Short-range missile attacks intensified. Ambushes on Israeli patrols in the security zone became increasingly deadly and sophisticated. The Israeli cities of Kiryat Shmona, Metula, and other northern towns lived under constant threat, marked by air raid sirens and underground shelters. Pressure within Israel grew in parallel. Public opinion began to question the purpose of keeping troops in hostile territory without a clear exit strategy. The number of fallen soldiers increased year after year, and national morale began to suffer. Finally, in the year 2000, the government led by Ehud Barak decided to carry out a unilateral withdrawal of all Israeli forces from southern Lebanon, ending an occupation that had lasted nearly 2 decades. The withdrawal was rapid and, for many, disorderly. In a matter of days, Israeli positions were abandoned, and the power vacuum was quickly filled by Hezbollah, which proclaimed the retreat as a historic victory against an enemy once considered invincible. The image of Hezbollah fighters waving flags along the border stirred concern among the Israeli public, who feared this new scenario might be only the prelude to even harsher conflicts. Time soon confirmed those fears. In July of 2006, following the kidnapping of 2 Israeli soldiers in a border ambush, Israel launched a massive offensive against Hezbollah. For 34 days, northern Israel was struck by more than 4,000 rockets, while the Israel Defense Forces responded with airstrikes and a ground incursion that ultimately failed to decisively dismantle the Shiite group's military infrastructure. The Second Lebanon War ended with a resolution by the United Nations that established the deployment of an international force and a commitment to Hezbollah's disarmament, which was never fully carried out. The border returned to a tense calm, but the threat remained latent. Israel strengthened its defense systems, including the creation of the Iron Dome system, designed to intercept short-range rockets, and intensified its intelligence operations in the area. The experience in Lebanon left a lasting mark on Israeli military strategy. The doctrine of deterrence was revised, urban combat tactics were updated, and civil defense planning was overhauled across all northern communities. But beyond military lessons, Israeli society learned that asymmetric conflicts, those in which the enemy is not a conventional army, present moral, strategic, and human dilemmas that far exceed what traditional war manuals can anticipate. And while the dust of the last clashes in the north was just beginning to settle, another front, much closer and much more emotionally charged for much of the Israeli and Palestinian populations, was starting to shake the very heart of the occupied territories. A new wave of protests, riots, and civil unrest was about to fundamentally reshape the dynamics of the conflict. Intifadas and the Oslo peace process. By the late 1980s, while Israel grappled with the consequences of its border conflicts and the internal dilemmas resulting from the occupation of Palestinian territories, a new wave of social unrest began to shake the streets, refugee camps, and alleyways of the West Bank and Gaza. What started as a series of spontaneous protests, driven by decades of accumulated frustration, quickly transformed into an uprising of historic proportions. The first Intifada had begun. The spark was a traffic accident in the Gaza Strip in December of 1987. But behind that singular event lay an ocean of frustration, despair, and rage. Military occupation, restrictions on movement, arbitrary detentions, and daily humiliations had deeply affected the Palestinian population. In a short time, the protests multiplied. Stones and Molotov cocktails became the symbol of a generation that chose to confront the Israeli army with whatever they had at hand. The Israeli Defense Forces, used to dealing with regular armies and defined enemies, suddenly found themselves in the midst of urban warfare, where the enemy wore no uniform, followed no traditional chain of command, and, most of all, was civilian. Images of soldiers facing teenagers with empty hands began to flood news broadcasts around the world, and Israel's international reputation began to deteriorate rapidly. The Israeli response, although forceful, failed to stop the rising tide of discontent. Repression sparked more protests, detentions ignited more fury, and the cycle of violence grew day by day. Meanwhile, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, tried to politically capitalize on the situation from its exile in Tunisia. However, the truth is, that much of the organization and mobilization of the Intifada was born from within, from the Palestinian neighborhoods themselves, without the need for external orders. International pressure also began to mount. The United States, Europe, and the United Nations multiplied their calls for a political solution. The narrative that for years had portrayed Israel as a small nation besieged by hostile neighbors began to shift. Now, the international community saw a state with one of the most powerful armies in the world attempting to contain an unarmed civilian population. Inside Israel, society became divided. On one side were those demanding a hardline stance, arguing that any concession would be seen as weakness. On the other side, a growing movement emerged calling for an end to the occupation and the beginning of serious negotiations with the Palestinians. Peace marches, massive demonstrations, and parliamentary debates reflected that the conflict was no longer an external matter. It had become an internal fracture that affected the moral and political fabric of the country. In this context of exhaustion and pressure, the first discrete contacts began between Israeli emissaries and representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization. After years of being considered irreconcilable enemies, both sides agreed to sit down and negotiate, but did so far from the media spotlight and in absolute secrecy. The chosen city was Oslo, capital of Norway, where Norwegian diplomats and mediators facilitated meetings that initially seemed doomed to fail. For months, representatives of both sides discussed, exchanged drafts, and tried to find a minimal formula for understanding. The talks took place in an atmosphere of deep distrust, with progress that often felt like setbacks, and under the constant shadow of radical sectors threatening to sabotage any agreement. Finally, in September of 1993, the world witnessed a moment that had once seemed impossible: the signing of the Oslo Accords. The image of Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands in the gardens of the White House under the gaze of Bill Clinton became etched as one of the great diplomatic milestones of the century. For the first time, Israel officially recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and in turn, the Palestine Liberation Organization accepted Israel's right to exist in peace within secure borders. The agreement envisioned the creation of the Palestinian National Authority, a body with limited powers in certain areas of Gaza and the West Bank. It also established a timeline to address the most sensitive issues: the status of Jerusalem, the final borders, Palestinian refugees, and the future of Israeli settlements. The reaction was immediate and polarized. In Israel, large sectors of the population saw the agreement as a historic opportunity to end the conflict. Others, however, perceived it as an existential threat. Leaders of the Israeli right wing, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, launched a fierce campaign against the Accords, arguing that they were a dangerous concession to an enemy that did not hide its desire to destroy the Jewish state. On the Palestinian side, the division was equally deep. While many embraced the hope of self-determination and the creation of their own state, other groups, such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, outright rejected the Accords, calling them a betrayal and vowing to continue the armed struggle. The Oslo process moved forward with ups and downs. Israel withdrew from certain territories, Palestinian elections were held, and security cooperation mechanisms were established. But at the same time, the process suffered constant attacks. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities, military reprisals, and continuous violations of the agreement's terms began to erode the fragile structure of trust that had taken so much effort to build. The most devastating blow came in November of 1995. During a peace rally in Tel Aviv, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist, a young radicalized man who considered the prime minister a traitor for having signed the Accords. Rabin's death was a national trauma. The crowd that attended his funeral reflected the pain and confusion of a country that, for the first time, realized that the enemy could be within its own borders, and that hatred was not the exclusive domain of one side or the other. After Rabin's death, the Oslo process began a slow but irreversible decline. New attacks, government changes in Israel, and the inability of both parties to advance on the most sensitive issues eventually froze the process. Distrust became the norm, and violence, the common language of each new breakdown. However, while the headlines once again filled with blood and the promises of peace seemed buried beneath the rubble of each new attack, a very different and much less visible phenomenon began to take shape within Israel. Far from the borders, away from political negotiations and parliamentary debates, a silent transformation was brewing in laboratories, universities, and research centers. A technological and economic revolution that, in just a few years, would place Israel at the center of global innovation. Startup nation and economic transformation. While international attention remained focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the seemingly endless geopolitical tensions, a completely different process was unfolding within Israel. A silent revolution that would, in just 2 decades, transform the country's economic, social, and technological structure. The lack of natural resources, far from being a curse, became the engine of constant innovation, forcing the nation to find solutions where others did not even realize there was a problem. Investment in higher education was one of the first strategic decisions that made a difference. Institutions such as the Technion in Haifa and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem became training centers for engineers, scientists, and mathematicians, who would soon begin to lead entire sectors of the global economy. Compulsory military service, which at first glance might seem limited to a defensive function, was transformed into a kind of laboratory in which young Israelis learned to solve problems under pressure, lead teams, and take calculated risks. The creation of specialized units in intelligence and cybersecurity, such as the well-known Unit 820, fostered the development of professional profiles with a level of technical preparation that very few countries could match. Many of the founders of technology startups that would later revolutionize the global market had their first contact with complex problem-solving precisely within these military units. Throughout the 1990s and well into the 2000s, hundreds of small technology companies began to emerge in cities such as Tel Aviv, Herzliya, and Haifa. What at first appeared to be a marginal trend turned into an unstoppable wave. Israel began to gain recognition as one of the most dynamic innovation ecosystems on the planet. Investment funds from the United States, Europe, and Asia turned their eyes toward this small Middle Eastern country, drawn by an irresistible combination of talent, boldness, and adaptability. The culture of failure also played a crucial role. In Israel, closing a company or failing to bring a project to fruition was not considered a stigma. On the contrary, it was interpreted as an essential learning step on the road to success. That tolerance for risk created an environment in which the boldest ideas could find space to develop. Sectors such as cybersecurity, medical technologies, precision agriculture, and smart mobility began producing companies that not only competed globally, but were acquired by technology giants such as Google, Intel, or Microsoft. Startups such as Waze, Mobileye, and Iron Source were born out of that combination of necessity, creativity, and drive. The Israeli government itself understood that it had to act as a catalyst for this growth. Public funds were created to co-finance technology projects, startup incubators were promoted, and tax incentive policies were introduced. The Israel Innovation Authority channeled resources and facilitated the creation of thousands of projects that otherwise would never have made it past the early development stages. This economic transformation was further strengthened by the demographic impact of immigration from the former Soviet Union, which brought with it an impressive pool of human capital. Engineers, doctors, scientists, and mathematicians, many of whom had decades of experience in applied research, found fertile ground in Israel to continue developing their professional careers. The Israeli economy grew at a steady pace. Gross domestic product soared. Technology exports surpassed traditional ones, and unemployment dropped significantly. Israel went from being a country dependent on foreign aid to becoming a nation that exports technology, innovation, and knowledge. However, that economic success also brought new contradictions. Social inequality increased, especially between those who directly benefited from the technology boom and those who were left behind, whether for educational, geographic, or cultural reasons. Housing prices in cities like Tel Aviv reached prohibitive levels, and the gap between the secular population and the ultra-Orthodox sectors, which are less integrated into the labor market, became more evident. On the international stage, Israel began to project a different image. It was no longer seen solely as a country in conflict, but also as a global benchmark for technological innovation. Foreign delegations, instead of visiting only historical or diplomatic sites, began touring technology parks, startup incubators, and development laboratories. The discovery of natural gas reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the 2010s added a new layer of economic optimism. Although the exploitation of these resources sparked political and environmental debates, it also opened up energy export opportunities that further strengthened Israel's position in the region. Still, while growth charts continued pointing upward and investment rounds reached figures that would have seemed unattainable just a few years earlier, the country remained acutely aware that no economic achievement could ever guarantee protection from both old and new security threats. That reminder came unexpectedly and brutally in the year 2023. When an event that caught the entire population by surprise once again tested, in an immediate and painful way, the resilience of a country long accustomed to living on the edge. The War of 2023 and the current landscape. October 7th, 2023, began as just another morning in southern Israel. The first light of day had barely appeared when the sound of air raid sirens broke the calm in cities such as Sderot, Ashkelon, and other towns near the Gaza Strip. Within minutes, hundreds of rockets began raining down on Israeli territory. Explosions shook buildings, destroyed roads, and left thousands of people trapped in improvised shelters. But that initial bombardment was only the prelude to what was to come. While Israelis tried to protect themselves from the missiles, an unprecedented ground, air, and sea offensive crossed the border from Gaza. Militants from Hamas, armed and organized, stormed kibbutzim, military bases, and small towns. In communities like Be'eri, Kfar Aza, and Nir Oz, the scenes of violence surpassed anything Israel had experienced in decades. Homes were set on fire, entire families were murdered, and dozens of civilians were kidnapped and taken into Gaza. Events that, within hours, changed the course of the country's recent history. The death toll increased by the hour. Civilians, soldiers, children, the elderly. The images that began circulating in the media and on social networks depicted a level of cruelty that shook the Israeli population to its core. The sense of vulnerability was absolute. For the first time in a long while, Israel, despite its military and technological apparatus, had been caught off guard in a way no one imagined possible. The Israeli government immediately declared a state of war. One of the largest reserve mobilizations in the country's history was activated. More than 300,000 soldiers were called to service in a matter of days. The aerial response began with massive bombings of Hamas positions inside the Gaza Strip. Government buildings, underground tunnels, weapons depots, and command centers were targeted without pause. But the urban density of Gaza and the inevitable mix of military and civilian targets caused the number of non-combatant casualties to rise alarmingly. Tragedy unfolded on both sides of the border. In Israel, the families of the kidnapped waited anxiously for news while the government attempted, under complete secrecy, to negotiate possible exchanges or releases. In Gaza, hospitals were overwhelmed, shelters were insufficient, and the civilian population lived in a state of permanent terror, with barely any access to drinking water, electricity, or basic medical supplies. International reactions were immediate. The United States reaffirmed its unconditional support for Israel's right to defend itself, but at the same time, voices began to emerge from the United Nations, the European Union, and humanitarian organizations, calling for restraint and respect for international law. Images of buildings reduced to rubble, of children beneath the remains of their homes, and of entire families fleeing aimlessly filled newscasts around the world. As the Israeli ground offensive advanced inside Gaza, urban combat intensified. The network of underground tunnels that Hamas had developed over years allowed its fighters to mount an unexpectedly fierce resistance. Every advance by Israeli troops was met with ambushes, snipers, and improvised explosives that inflicted significant casualties. The situation on the northern border also began to deteriorate. Hezbollah from Lebanon started launching rockets and projectiles at northern Israel, forcing the army to mobilize additional forces to avoid an escalation on two simultaneous fronts. The possibility of a broader regional conflict became a real fear. As the weeks went by, the number of dead and wounded grew dramatically. In Israel, alarms continued to sound daily in the south and center of the country. In Gaza, the number of internally displaced people reached historic levels. Negotiations to reach intermittent ceasefires occurred one after another, but progress was minimal, and the truces, when they were achieved, lasted only hours or days before fighting resumed. Egypt, Qatar, and other international mediators tried, without much success, to organize a process to end the violence. The conditions demanded by each side seemed unacceptable to the other. Hamas demanded the lifting of the blockade and the release of prisoners, while Israel demanded the immediate return of the hostages and the dismantling of the group's military infrastructure. Within Israel, society lived in a state of pain, anger, and anxiety. The families of the hostages began organizing marches and protests, demanding that the government find an urgent solution to bring their loved ones home. Political debates intensified, and the national unity that had seemed solid in the first days of the conflict began to show cracks in the face of the tragedy's magnitude and the lack of visible results. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the humanitarian situation became unsustainable. Hospitals, without resources, tried to treat thousands of wounded. The streets filled with rubble, and with families wandering in search of a minimally safe place. The international community intensified the delivery of humanitarian aid, but the entry of supplies remained limited and dangerous due to the context of open war. Analysts began to warn that the conflict could drag on for months, perhaps even longer, with no clear political exit in the short term. The economic consequences within Israel were already being felt. Tourism collapsed, foreign investments froze, and a large portion of the reservist population remained mobilized, affecting the country's productive fabric. Today, despite calls for a negotiated solution, the war remains active. Military operations continue, rockets are still falling on Israeli soil, and incursions into Gaza have not stopped. The families of the hostages are still waiting for news. Civilians in Gaza are still counting their dead, and the entire region remains on edge, with no one, not even the most optimistic, daring to predict how or when this new tragedy will end. For now, the only certainty is that the conflict remains open. The pain is accumulating on both sides of the border, and the immediate future of Israel, Gaza, and the entire region remains wrapped in an uncertainty as dense as the smoke that still covers the sky in the south. And thus we come to the end of this extensive journey through the history of Israel. A complex story, full of nuances, of advances and setbacks, of moments of hope and dark chapters that continue to leave deep scars. From the ancient biblical kingdoms to the most recent tragedies, the narrative of this small but influential country continues to be written day by day. Between innovation and war, between dialogue that never quite takes hold, and conflicts that seem to have no end. Now I want to know your opinion. After listening to this journey through history, how do you see what is currently happening in Israel and Gaza? Do you believe there is any possible solution to this conflict that has cost so many lives? How do you interpret the impact of this latest war and the consequences it may have on a regional and global scale? Leave your thoughts below in the comments. I am interested in reading all kinds of opinions, always expressed with respect and critical analysis. If you found this content interesting, do not forget to support it with a like and subscribe so you do not miss future documentaries on historical and geopolitical topics like this one. Thank you for staying with us until the end. See you on the next journey through history. Good night.